All right, hey, my name is Zach, and how many of you here grew up in or live in an urban neighborhood where you like your privacy and you have a nice big yard, and that's the way you're used to growing up? All right, well, tonight I'm going to prove to you guys that these modern neighborhoods and modern urbanism that lacks sustainable characteristics, and things are going to have to change before we run out of land. So I'm going to show you that our modern architecture and ideas of what a house is causing us to run out of room. Our independence among our neighbors is inefficient, and that our use of water is also inefficient and impractical. So in the 1970s, the average house, according to the National Home Builders Association, used to be 1,500 square feet, and now the house sizes are 2,300 square feet, and the amount of people living in a house has decreased by 25%. So that means we have less people living in less people living in bigger living areas, and that's just the way that people have become more appreciative of their privacy. And so this idea of privacy leads us to the next thing that's bad about modern neighborhoods, and that is that we like to be independent. It's become socially acceptable to not know your neighbors' names or not interact with your neighbors. And this doctor that graduated from BYU wrote an essay, or wrote a book called The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the habits is that effective people synergize and combine their talents to create something that is greater than just the sum of the parts. So it's more like a exponential growth instead of just multiplication. And then the last idea of modern neighborhoods that is affecting our sustainability is our use of water. And not only the amount of water that we use to water lawns and stuff, but our use of concrete also affects the groundwater. And a water engineer named Larry Mays wrote a book talking about how the groundwater doesn't get to the ground, or the rain doesn't get to the ground, and due to the paving, and it just carries more pollution with it, the water that does get into the ground. And there's things underground which are called aquifers, which is where most of the people around the world get their groundwater from. And with the less amount of water going into them, they're not able to recharge. And it just adds more pollution to it. So in conclusion, I just wanted to inform you about how we need to change as like how we see housing and how we live in California needs to change, because we're going to run out of room pretty soon. With the next 20 years, we're expected to have between 7 million and 11 million new residents, according to the but right now we're at 35 million people, and then we're going to be at 45 million people. So if you can imagine, like 33% more people on the freeways, or 33% more people living in an area. And that's it for tonight. Thanks.
All right, Zach. The survey at the beginning is fine, and I thought it made a nice transition to your topic. You do state the claim. You've got a tag ending on the end of it that almost makes it a policy claim, so you want to be a little careful about that. You laid out the secondary issues relatively clearly, so I don't have a big problem with that. But those points need a lot more development than they're getting. I didn't think that you did a very thorough job. For instance, on the information about how the people living in these neighborhoods don't know their neighbors and the connection to whether or not they're effective. I don't know how you get to that conclusion. I guess the idea is that if we don't know our neighbors, we're not being productive, or we're losing an opportunity for collaboration in some way. I think that's a huge leap that needs a lot more data to support it, especially since you need to contrast it to maybe the styles in which people lived before. You're saying that there is a difference. Well, we should be able to measure that difference in some way. The effectiveness of communities finding solutions for their problems, for instance, their willingness to support expansion of public services, maybe that would be some way that you could measure that. It just seems to me like you're making a huge inference here without having any proof on that particular point. On the point about the water issue, for instance, you got a vague reference to an engineer who wrote a book, and I don't know when the book came out and what the basis of it was, and you basically have paraphrased what the content of the book is into a single sentence, and we have no data that suggests that there's not sufficient water in the aquifer, that there's more demands being made on it, that there's less water going into it. I just have this general statement about this, and so it's not particularly convincing on that point. And by the way, your citation about the 7 Habits of Effective People, or whatever the source citation was, the reference to a doctor who went to BYU said, that's just not, you don't even have their name. That's really problematic. So organizationally, you're in good shape. I think you do a nice job talking to the audience for the most part, but you are not developing proof for the claims that you're presenting. You kind of explain the idea. You've got 1 or 2 vague references on each of those points, and as far as being convincing, I just think it's not sufficient to affect the audience or move them to the conclusions that you're talking about. I thought that you started off really well, too, with the statistic that you had about the average size of homes and the average number of people living in those homes. I thought that there's a good grounding point at the beginning. And then you had one more statistic toward the end that I thought also worked pretty effectively. You kind of had your exit line, and then you stepped on it a little bit by adding a tag argument at the end, and then you have to come back and find an exit line, and you have the usual graceless, that's it. And I think that that's a little awkward. A little more planning, a little more practice would fix those issues. All right, thank you.